Welcome to today's Next Generation Alliance webinar on cross-cultural ministry. I'm David Jones. It's been my privilege to serve with the Luis Palau Association for the past 38 years. I'll be your moderator today. Our guest speaker is Dr. Jim Williams, known across the Spanish-speaking world as Jaime Morón. Dr. Williams has ministered since 1968 with the Palau Association. He's a graduate of Biola University and Talbot Seminary with studies in cross-cultural communication at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Dr. Williams earned his doctorate from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Recently, Jim spent over 10 years overseeing and editing the New Living Translation Bible into the Spanish language. The Spanish NLT has become one of the best-selling Bibles in the Spanish world. Jim and his wife Gail have been married for 50 years. They have one son and 4 grandsons. And if you have questions for Jim today, there'll be a box, a question field on the right side of your computer screen. Or if you're using your phone, you can email questions to nga@palau.org. So please welcome Jim Williams, or as he's known to most of you, Dr. Jaime Morón. And Jim, just a reminder, the webinar is in English.
Yeah, I know, but we got to work on your pronunciation of Morón. It's Morón. Yeah, thank you. And I just hope as we go into this webinar of communicating the gospel cross-culturally, it doesn't sound too much like a college lecture. Communicating the gospel cross-culturally, and to do this, I want to start with a definition of culture. As I said, I hope this doesn't sound too much like a lecture in a university, where you're taking notes and you will be tested. So we're going to start with a definition of culture. Culture does not refer to etiquette or a cultured person or education. Culture can be looked at, very important, as a body of ready-made solutions to the problems encountered by any group. Culture is the sum of learned behavior, patterns, attitudes, and material things. It is the entire complex of all ways and expressions of life which characterize any nation or group. Now, I want to take a look, taking that as a background, let's take a look at one of the biggest cultural problems in the world, a childless couple. Now, how do they solve it? How do they solve the childless couple problem in different parts of the world? Here, we do it by adoption. But I want to take a look at Genesis 16. Exact problem. Sarai did the culturally accepted thing there in Genesis 16. She brought in the servant girl and gave the servant girl to her husband. Now, in that culture, this was considered acceptable. It was common, by the way. It was not considered immorality in the culture. And according to them, or right from the surface, it solved the problem. They didn't see the consequences that were going to come later. However, we ask, was this God's will? Absolutely not. But you can see the power and influence of culture upon people. That body of ready-made solutions to problems encountered by a group. Now, you can tell how much influence culture has upon a person when anybody has a very difficult decision to make, or is under incredible pressure, or has been insulted, or is in a situation where he has to save face, or in a similar situation. How does he respond? Does he respond the way the culture, that ready-made body of solution, or has the gospel broken through into his life? So he responds the way the Bible wants. Now, the various features that distinguish one culture from another are called cultural components. Each part of culture fits a need. If a change is made in one part, it will affect the entire culture. And what is the most important part of culture? Religion. It holds the rest of the culture in many places together. So, each culture has priorities. Now, they're unwritten, but they are priorities. For instance, the world that I know the best is Latin America. And in Latin America, people are more important than plans. I mean, you don't have to do something in Latin America to have a good time. Second, being nice is more important than being honest. You tell the people what you think they want to hear. Now, that has some implications in the way we give an invitation to receive Christ in Latin America. Third, the immediate and who's in front of you right now is more important than the future, who you might be going to. That's why, if you're walking down a hall, the American will say, hey, hi, catch you later, because you had an appointment. In Latin America, you'd stop and talk to the person, even though you'd be late to that appointment. Then you take a look at who is admired in the culture and why. In the U.S., the person who is admired is the person who began with nothing, worked himself up by hard work. In England, that person is looked at with suspicion. To get there, they reason, they had to walk on someone. So it's more important over there to have the right last name, the accent, the education, and of course, not being an American. Nepotism is not looked at well in the U.S., but in most third world countries, it's not as expected, but it's honored. When the son, for example, of the evangelist is sent to visit, it's considered a big honor. The key in Latin America is the man. Our churches are filled with women. Who is admired by the man? And thinking about how you present Jesus. His hero is strong, virile, valiant, he's stubborn, he's fuerte. In fact, he's the world's most interesting man. He will be a real man, a good drinker, a lover, a singer, a fighter. He will be brave, and he'll be willing to believe what he defends in. You can lose face by doing unmanly acts. I remember Luis told me many years ago that when he came to the U.S., he would not help out around the house. He does now. He wouldn't even cut the grass. That was considered unmanly. He wouldn't do it. Mutual respect is built upon a distance, not upon getting together. I remember when we were in Mexico, a missionary came and wanted to start an accountability group. And accountability was becoming big. And if you speak Spanish and you're listening to me today, try translating accountability group into Spanish, and let me know what you come up with, because we don't have a word for accountability in Spanish. I mean, we can say it, but we have to use a phrase and we have to explain it. So this missionary started off this group by saying, "This week I committed a sin," meaning he's opening himself up and he's being a model. And what happened to the group? They closed in. Because, whoa, we don't know each other enough for you to be able to saying that. Let's go into the components of culture. The first component is language. You go to a different country, you need to learn the language. Now, there's three ways to learn a language, three aspects. First of all, your natural ability. Now, you've got a natural ability, and someone else might have a different natural ability. However, more important than that is the depth of desire, how hard you really want to learn that language. And then the third component is the opportunity to practice it every day on a consistent basis. That's why they have all year-round schools in some parts of the United States, so people from other countries don't lose their English over the summer. Now, I want to suggest something else if you're learning a language. You could learn a lot about the people and the culture from the language. Spanish, for example, is lived in the subjunctive. The subjunctive is the what-ifs and the maybes, and while English is lived in the indicative, straight from the shoulder. You can see a difference right there in the culture in the two countries. Another thing is you go into a culture, and you want to look at the way decisions are made as far as the components of culture. The center of authority. Where does the center of authority lie? Is it individual, collective, small group, the oldest person? Who makes the decisions? Take a look at the family. How do family members relate with each other? How do the children treat older members in the family? Next, religion. This is the most important part of any culture. Study the religion. Are they afraid of their gods? That could certainly help you in your preaching, if they're afraid of their gods. Is there any fear involved at all? In Latin America, we like to preach Christ, of who he really is, strong, and he's got power. 6, I want to I want to mention something here. Maybe you've read about it on the internet. Maybe not. Difference between shame and guilt cultures. There's very few guilt cultures in the world. The United States is one of them, although it is fading away. A guilt culture is basically made through the gospel. It's made. And the difference is this. You're not guilty unless seen or caught in a shame culture. In a guilt culture, you're guilty whether anybody sees you or not. Now, I'll give you one example. 12 o'clock, you're alone, you come up to a intersection and a red light is on. Do you stop or you go right through it? Nobody's watching you, I stop. But in many parts of the world, it would be no one's looking, you just go right through it. Also, there's some other reasons why to go through it. Sometimes it's dangerous not to. In Latin America, you just stop. Second, restraint is from without in a shame culture. And in a guilt culture, restraint is from within. Third, difficulty in accepting personal responsibility. There's always someone to blame. And then in a guilt culture, you accept personal responsibility. And fourth, there is always someone to blame. Remember, this started early. The serpent. It's the serpent's fault. And then Adam said, the woman you gave me. And then you look for solutions in the guilt culture. The challenges in cross-cultural communication. Right from the beginning, when you're communicating cross-culture, you want accuracy and relevancy. Now, and so these two are always in competition with each other. Felt needs versus real needs. A relevant message will deal with the felt needs, but so as to reach the real needs. Accuracy is representing what God, not men, think. So we want to be accurate and relevant. So let's go. Number one, we have one that's high in relevancy, but low in accuracy. In other words, we deal with people's felt needs, but we do not faithfully represent what God thinks, what the Bible says. Now, unfortunately, many churches that I deal with in Latin America deal well with felt needs, but they do not accurately represent what God says. Next, we have high in accuracy, but low in relevancy. Your God's thoughts are well presented, but you don't deal with the felt needs of the people. You never touch the soul. Then we have some that are low in relevancy and low in accuracy. I don't even want to talk about them. And then number four, high in relevancy and high in accuracy. That's what we want to be. So we want to know what the culture is. We want to know what the felt needs is. We want to speak to those. We want to accurately represent what Jesus says. Culture inevitably has three elements to it. Number one, parts that support biblical principles. You go in, you find these things. The typical family in Latin America is very united. You can build upon that. Then there are parts that are neutral. That first one, we use them and we build upon those. But then there's parts that are neutral. They're not like our culture, but they're not wrong. They're just different. And when we go into a foreign culture, we adjust to these. For instance, in some cultures, you don't eat until the oldest person arrives. It's different, but it's not wrong. If you've ever been to Argentina, Italy, Spain, you have to get used to eating a big dinner after 10 p.m. at night, maybe after 11. It's not wrong, it's just different. Then third, there's parts that contradict biblical principles. These we have to stand against. Now, I'm going to give an illustration here. You're going to say, it's one of these things that if it hadn't actually happened, you would have said, nah, he made that up. I received an email from a friend in Central America on a Friday. And so she said, a guy from our church, he's married, is running around with a single girl. What'll I do? And she says, I know the single girl. I said, well, take her out for coffee, sit her down with the Bible open, and explain to her that she's in sin, etc., etc. So she did that, and the girl repented. It was amazing. She repented. Okay. couple of weeks later, I get an email from the same person saying the same guy's running around with another single girl in the church. This was on a Friday, and she said, I don't know who the girl is. I don't know her, I said, well, let me wait until Monday, and I'll give you an answer. Monday, I get an email, problem solved. Problema solucionado. It says problem solved. What happened is that they found the guy with 5 bullets in him. And it was a pattern, here, 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 and lower. Well placed. Now, what happened? Now, this all happened within the Christian church. I mean, it's not like we're talking about, they hired, have you seen the movie? I haven't seen it. I've just seen the title. Sicario. Sicario means hitman. And so they hired a hitman, and it was the parents of the girl got together with the parents of the wife, hired a hitman, problem solved. Now, that is, going back to Genesis 16, common, more common than we'd want to let on to. It's, and everyone laughs up their sleeve. He got what he deserved, and people didn't even really think it was that bad. See, that's culture. Those things that contradict culture. As Christians, we don't handle things in that way. So it takes a great deal of discernment to know which are against biblical principles and when and how to stand against them. Now, in traditional cultures, a traditional culture is not much influence from the outside. The culture plays a huge part in life. We here have a fractured culture, but we can still see evidences of it. Now, I'm going to go into 1 Corinthians 9 now. If you have your Bible, open it to 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19. But before we go on, I want to recommend 3 movies that deal with culture. I mean, if you look through them for eyes for culture, The Good Lie. If you haven't seen The Good Lie, you need to. The Sudanese refugees that came over here, and the part in the movie where they go out just to look at cattle, because that's what they knew. They knew cattle, and they just went out to look at them. The $1 Million Arm. You can see some cultural aspects. Some of you who are evangelists who have to go overseas and never get receipts or contracts. This agent goes to India and they won't even sign him for a contract. Then McFarland USA. You can see how much religion is part of life in McFarland. I've been in McFarland, and it's really a pretty good movie. Now, 1 Corinthians 9. 19 to 23. Paul, I'll admit, when I first read this passage in depth, it made me nervous. Even though I'm a free man with no master, I've become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. Verse 21. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God, I obey the law of Christ. Verse 22, when I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. Wow, what a passage. So, 3 things, and then if we have some time, I want to talk about how to speak through a translator. And I'll ask Jeff if there's any time left. To penetrate another culture, number 1, I think Paul says it takes clear goals. Verse 19, to bring many to Christ. Verse 22, doing everything I can to save some. 6 times in this short paragraph, Paul states the goal, his desire to win as many people to Christ. And this keeps him from not getting distracted. If there's no goal, there will not be much prayer, no purpose. So, number 2, verses 19 to 23, it takes adaptability. Cultural issues are an important part of communication. This is not only true for the evangelist that goes into a foreign culture, it's just more obvious for the evangelist that goes into a foreign culture. People can hear the message of Christ better when it comes from someone who adapts to the hearer's culture. I think that's what Paul's saying here. Cultural dissidence or not adapting to the other culture, makes it more difficult to hear the gospel. God does not require the people to give up their culture to come to Him. Win them in their territory, and once saved, then they'll find the beauty of Galatians 3:28. There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, for you're all one in Jesus Christ. Christians sometimes confuse cultural preferences with biblical absolutes. We've seen that in parts of Latin America. There's confusion regarding the importance of culture to evangelism. There's confusion regarding the difference of culture and doctrine. And there's also fear of getting out of our own comfort zone. I will admit that has been one of mine. Now, Paul talks about three categories in this passage. He talks about the Jews. Paul was willing to live under the restrictions of the Jewish people. He was willing to live again with the dietary restrictions, the ritual and the ceremony. He was willing to live again as a Jew when he was with them. And in fact, Acts 16:3 says, Paul wanted him, Timothy, to join them on their journey. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. However, Paul never violated a biblical principle. That's very important. This is not evangelism. This is not preaching the gospel. It's pre-evangelism. It's bringing down barriers. It's searching for common ground. And there is one rule here: never violate a biblical principle. This takes study, it takes wisdom, it takes discernment and knowledge. Second, he talks about those without law. Paul was willing to adapt to the customs of the Gentile people. For this, there was a qualifier: in other than moral matters. Paul identified as closely as possible to Gentile customs: food, activities, dress. I remember, I think Dave Jones, who's here to my left, was with me in Hong Kong when we met Hudson Taylor's grandson, I think it was. And let me tell you, he looked like a Westerner, but he was a Chinese. He really was. Now, Hudson Taylor made a radical decision. He received both criticism and praise. He decided to dress like the Chinese and grow a pigtail. His decision was rooted in his deep respect for the Chinese culture and his view of what you do to spread the gospel. But there's a third one here: the weak. Paul adapted to the weak in order to bring the weak to Christ. Now, John MacArthur interprets the weakness of comprehension, so it would be, to the simple I became simple. Some commentators, I found out, just skip it. But there's a tendency to go back to 1 Corinthians 8 and interpret the weak in Christ. But you know, it says here the goal is to win them to Christ. I'm thinking we're talking about something different here. I think we're talking about non-Christians who have scruples sometimes that we as Christians don't have. Then they get offended easily. For instance, Hindus, you might want to give up your right to eat meat. Jews, don't have any cheeseburgers. Islam, in an Islamic country, you might want to alter your form of worship and grow a beard. Buddhists, figure out a way to honor ancestors without worshiping them. Catholics, honor Mary without giving her a place that the Bible does not give her. And Mormons, you don't drink a Coke in front of them, let's face it. So, Paul says, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. Summary: Paul would restrict his liberty. Paul would not offend. Paul would identify with the people, but would never change the truth or compromise the gospel. Would never sin or violate his conscience. Now, to me, if the person or subgroup is going to be offended, I think we need to let him be offended by the cross and not by us. Galatians 5:11 says, if I were no longer preaching salvation through the cross of Christ, no one would be offended. So if the person is offended by our traditions, as good as they might be, it becomes our problem, our rigidness, our lack of adaptability. But if it's the gospel, if it's the cross, then that's the person's problem. Finally, it takes discipline. 1 Corinthians 9:24-27. Paul says, I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. What is he saying here? To be able to do what Paul is suggesting, be all things to all people, it not only takes a goal and adaptability, it takes discipline. The second we make evangelism, winning the lost, as the goal, we're in the race. And we do not compete against each other. As you know, sometimes it sounds like we are. We don't compete against each other, but against obstacles, practical, spiritual, physical, that would hinder us in preaching the gospel. So, what does the athlete do? To reach a goal, he must limit his diet, limit his liberty, and do a lot of exercises. This is not determined by my rights or my feelings. It's based upon what must be done to win the lost to Christ. And some people get disqualified. I mean, it's happened a lot recently in NASCAR because they violated the rules and they get disqualified. They broke the rules. Today's runners can be disqualified for running out of their lane, tripping another runner, use of banned drugs such as steroids. And the point is, they were disqualified. There is a reason for so much preparation, so much self-denial, that after preaching the gospel, we may not be disqualified. Now, I'm going to ask my friend over to the right here, Jeff Piper, if I've got 6 minutes left to talk about how to speak through an interpreter. I got the thumbs up. Okay, I want to talk about how to speak through an interpreter because I've interpreted and I've been interpreted. I was interpreted in China, in Finland, in Denmark, in Japan. I spoke in Spanish. In Japan, it was interpreted in Japanese. And then in some indigenous tribes in certain parts of Latin America. So I've been on both sides. I've spoken through and I've interpreted several people. Here are some tips if you're going to speak through an interpreter. Number one, meet in advance to go over the message. Go over any difficult concepts or words that may not translate well into target language. Example, accountability group. And so when it comes up, you don't have to think, how am I going to say that? And it's just going to flow right out. Make all of the scripture to be used available at that time to be looked up. Here's what I do. When I'm interpreting, I take my computer up there on the platform and have it there, and I put all the scriptures in a row so I get them exactly right at the right time. Second, meet with the interpreter beforehand to pray. It helps in the bonding of the two. Then you might want to speak a little more slowly than usual. Now, normally the interpreter is translating into his own language. And so one of the keys is that he understand you. And I can remember sitting down somewhere, I think it was in Costa Rica not too long ago, thinking, uh-oh, he misunderstood that. Whoop, he missed it. Ooh, that was the exact opposite. And then speak in relatively short sentences. Now that's not true in Chinese, but but most languages it is. Speak in relatively short sentences. Give the translator the chance to get it right. Humor is great. I mean, humor goes over in every country, but make sure that your humor is not based on a play of words in your language or something that would not translate into the culture. When I get that, when I'm translating, I just tell the people, when I get to a certain part, I want you to laugh like crazy because he's telling a joke that is not translatable. 6, do your best to avoid slang. Interpreters tend to be concrete, and if you use any play on words or slang, they're going to get the wrong idea. Number 7, don't speak over the interpreter. Don't. I remember I was in Oaxaca, and we were up 9,000 feet, and there were 2 speakers, myself and another speaker who didn't speak Spanish, and he got so excited that he didn't get the interpreter. And I'm sitting out there, I'm not understanding the English, and I'm not understanding the Spanish, because he was talking right over the guy. He was so excited. You know, remember, the audience will understand him and not you. When I was speaking, when I was interpreting for Reed Saunders in the Dominican Republic, the people were actually looking at me. You know, and then keep eye contact with the audience and not with the interpreter. There's a tendency to look at the interpreter. Keep it with you're speaking to them. Afterwards, be sure to thank the interpreter, because he gets a lot of criticism. It's difficult. He's got to come up with things right on the spot. So those are some ideas. Do we have any questions?
All right, Jim. Dave Jones here. Got a bunch of questions.
Oh, dear.
So share an example of someone who missed the mark or missed the audience due to a lack of cultural sensitivity.
Well, okay, I can think of two right off the top of my head, and I was present at both of these. And so the first one, he missed the mark not in the message, because the message doesn't change, but in the illustrations. He was completely out of sync with the people in his illustrations. And so I don't know if I want to go more in details than that, but I think that's a good illustration. Another place where we were, and I think you were with me, I'm looking at my wife here, you were with me, and a world-renowned speaker, he spoke just before I did, world-renowned speaker, he missed the audience completely. He didn't take time to figure out who was going to be there, where they are. What he did is he went in and spoke about his latest book. And it just really, really missed the people.
Here's another question. Is it possible to adjust elements of a culture that's maybe perceived as evil but could be used for good? Something like spiritual dances by Native Americans or clothing that might have spiritual significance. Should one, or is it possible, should you try to adjust elements of culture?
That's a good one, and that's been going on for years, and there's different ideas in that, because we do need to take a look at what that means in the culture. I mean, what are you communicating if you do that in the culture? One of those things can be even something in foreign cultures like a tattoo. You know, you say, okay, what does that tattoo mean in this culture? You know, is it worshiping foreign gods? Because we know, if you're worshiping foreign gods, you're worshiping demons. So from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, I do think it is possible. Now, there's lots of different illustrations, but I think that one of them is Halloween. Halloween is now spreading around the world. It's unbelievable. It's spreading around the world. You know, the people don't know what it means, but it's spreading around the world. Is there a way to handle that? I'll tell you. Let me give you one illustration. Our grandsons, we have 4 grandboys. You know, they went out in Halloween. I mean, this is the devil's holiday. Let's face it. Halloween is. They went out door to door dressed as the armor of God. And one of them was the sword of the Spirit, one of them, and they were dressed as the armor of God. And they had a chance to say, well, what are you dressed up? We're the armor of God. So I think there are ways, if you think it through, that you can use some of those things, Yeah, I do, but it has to be done. Oh, boy, does that take discernment?
Okay, here's another one. The Bible's the inspired word of God. It transcends culture. And yet we see, especially with Jesus, the message being adapted for the audience. Are there Bible passages or stories that just don't adapt well in some cultures?
Yeah, they do. I mean, you take a non-sheep culture. What are you going to do? Here we have the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, and we don't have a sheep. We don't have a lamb. So you've got two options there. I've been through 10 years of Bible interpretation. You can't believe the times that we sat around and the times that we wrote to Wycliffe and to see what they had done in different cultures. But you got a couple of options when you're talking about a non-sheep culture. You can look around to see if they have an animal that has the same characteristics that they would understand and use that, or you can teach them what a lamb is. So yeah, there are some things that don't cross over, into the culture, and you have to know how to adapt it, because this is the Word of God.
As evangelists who travel internationally, we quickly go in and out of a culture. So how should we prepare? How can we find out what we need to know so as to avoid cultural faux pas?
Okay, that's a good one. I think one thing you can do is take that list of cultural components. And if you're going to go into a culture, Let me tell you what I've helped Mike Silva do. Many of the people who are listening know who Mike Silva is. He goes in with a ready, set number of questions. And we go out and find out. Now, I know most of them because it's Latin America anyway, but we go out and try to find the answers to those questions. That what we did with where is the center of authority, how did the family and different things, what are the biggest problems in the culture, and things like that. That's one thing you can do. Another thing that I've always done, when I used to travel with Luis all over the world, and in the last how many years, at least 20, I've only gone to Latin America. Well, except other countries like Japan that speak in Spanish. But and that is to every culture has a question and answer thing in their newspapers. Like a Japanese or a Finnish or a Dear Abby. And where those were available, I got a hold of those. And usually there was an English newspaper there, or someone could tell me what are the problems in that culture? What are they talking about? And how are they solving them? So there's lots of things you can do. Another thing you can do is find someone from that culture who lives near you, who speaks English, and go over and talk to them about the culture. We're doing that right now. We're having a great time doing premarital counseling with a young Indian man. And his parents just came over from India to go to the, and we're asking him a lot about the Indian culture and how they make decisions and the different things like that. So yeah, there are a lot of things you can do, Dave.
All right, here's another one. Words, hand gestures, clothing, humor, you touched on that. Even colors. Colors mean different things in different cultures. So how can an evangelist not only prepare, but make sure they have a good interpreter who has the freedom to protect them from mistakes, from all those faux pas you talked about earlier?
Yeah, you got to make good friends with that interpreter. And you got to go up and tell them. And this may not be cultural, but go up and tell them, I don't want to make mistakes, and if I make one, I never want to make it again. So if I'm making, for instance, you can see this hand gesture. In most parts, an evangelist that does this. This is giving the finger in Peru. So someone needed to go to that evangelist and tell him, you don't do this here, and no one did it. So you've got to have someone there listen, and as an evangelist you say, I don't want to make any cultural faux pas. Will you tell me anytime I make a mistake? And I know it's not cultural for you because I'm the great teacher, in Latin America we're called the ungido, the anointed one, no one will correct us. But you tell them, look, this is for the gospel's sake, I want you to correct me.
Are there resources where an evangelist can find out in each culture what are the faux pas?
Yes, there are. Now, I know there are in Latin America. There's lots of books, not lots, but quite a few. One of the best, if you're going to Mexico, is The X in Mexico. And because the X in Mexico is pronounced differently than it is, I mean, I write Mexico with a J. I don't write with an X. Only a Mexican can pronounce it Mexico. So that book, The X in Mexico, is really an opening into the Mexican culture. And there are usually books like that in every place you're going if you look for them.
Well, Jim, this has been excellent. We've got a little time here. Any closing comments? Anything you wanted to touch on, but thought we were running out of time? We do have a few minutes.
Oh, I thought we were out of time. No,
we're looking good.
No. I just think that it is a wonderful thing to go from culture to culture, and as you go through Latin America. I mean, as you go through the Old Testament, you'll see some people didn't understand the language anymore, so they had to bring in interpreters. So the Old Testament is familiar with interpreters, and the New Testament is familiar with accents, as is the Old Testament. They knew they were Galileans because of their accent, So all of that stuff is there in the Old Testament if you can find it, and in the New Testament. So and continue studying culture. It's a fascinating thing, and it will help you in your preaching of the gospel. The message never changes, but the methods do.
Jaime, thank you very much. This has been excellent. And for those of you that are part of today's webinar, it will be in a few days posted on the NGA website, so you can review it again and look at your notes, it will be at www.nextgenerationalliance.org on the resource page. Our next webinar is going to be Thursday, May 12, 9 a.m. Pacific time. And evangelist Scott Dawson and his colleague Scott Lenny, they're going to do a webinar for us on It Takes a Team to Launch a Dream. I know for many of our members, team building and growing an organization and having a really good evangelistic team is a priority. And Scott Dawson, founder of the Scott Dawson Evangelistic Association, and his right-hand man, Scott Lenny, they're going to do a webinar for us on Thursday, May 12 on that very topic. We hope you can all join us for that. And then we also want to remind you that coming up in July 14 and 15 is our next big NGA conference. It's our Connect conference in Washington, D.C. at the JW Marriott. Seating is limited, hotel space is limited, so please register now, and you can find the registration for that on the NGA website as well. And then on July 16, we'll all be together on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. for the Together event. And this will be a historic moment in our nation's history as we all gather July 16 on the Mall. So Jim, thanks again for today's webinar on cross-cultural ministry. A big thank you to all of those on the line who participated. We appreciate all of you very much. God bless you and keep doing the work of an evangelist. Until next time, thank you.